The Threadbare Fleece in the TestiScan 3000 by K. Brad Barfield. The Threadbare Fleece, an introduction by K. Brad Barfield. The adjuster never thought much about the jacket. It had been with him so long, threadbare, coffee-stained, its zipper half-busted, that it seemed less an object than an extension of himself. Over the years it had taken on a presence. Some nights on the road, when owls called from fence posts and trucks roared down empty highways, the fleece almost seemed to breathe. He had grown superstitious about it, tugging it tight whenever the world felt like it was sliding off its axis. It was more than clothing. It was armor, co-pilot, and confession booth. It was, in his own words, the only thing that kept him stitched together. And yet, that fragile tether was tested when the blue message bubble appeared. The message was simple, delivered with the bureaucratic cheer of an office memo. Mandatory for all male livestock policies, portable, lightweight, user-friendly, introducing the TestiScan 3000. The words hit him harder than any denial of claim or rejection of paperwork ever had. A picture followed, a sleek chrome contraption that looked like something NASA forgot in a barn, its padded loops and dangling belts suggesting not progress but a revival of medieval cruelty. To the brokers it was innovation. To him it was body horror. He had spent a lifetime in the gray corridors of insurance, chasing risk across pastures and barns, measuring liability in livestock pens and hay barns, scribbling numbers into ledgers as if tallying ghosts. He could endure the endless forms. He could stomach the brokers who spoke of metrics as if they were scripture. He could even live with the laughter of owls echoing from tree lines as he filed his late-night reports. But this machine was a bridge too far. The very thought of it turned his stomach. He imagined cornering an emu and strapping the chrome device under its feathered undercarriage and listening to the hum of its sensors. Numbers would scroll across the screen like slot machines. Graphs would bloom on the iPad like cancer cells. And back at headquarters, men in pressed shirts would nod solemnly, declaring, "Testicular metrics are the future of liability insurance." The fleece stiffened at the idea. He swore he felt it prickle against his skin as though protesting. It was his codependent sidekick, his last shred of dignity, and it growled at the thought of becoming an accessory to such grotesque quantification. Somebody else was going to run that machine, not me, not the fleece. But inevitability is its own kind of policy, and his fate was as predetermined as the unraveling seams on his jacket. The day came when he hauled the TestiScan 3000 from the bed of his truck. It buzzed faintly, like a coffin with straps that had learned to breathe. Sweat slicked his back. His fleece clung tight, whispering, "Don't do it. You can't quantify everything." The emu stood in the pen, watching him with ancient, glassy eyes, its long neck coiled. Its feathers shimmered like old varnish. He muttered, "All right, boy, just got to slip this contraption under your situation, quick and easy." He sank to his knees in the dirt, cradling the machine like an unholy infant, and entered the pen. But the emu hadn't seen the training video. The bird shrieked, a sound like a trumpet swallowed by thunder, and lunged. In the chaos, the TestiScan lit up, beams of green slicing across feathers and air. The iPad in the truck cab flickered with graphs, jittering numbers spiking to absurd heights. The machine delivered its absurd verdict: testicular capacity unstable. It should have ended there, in mud, feathers, and humiliation. But something else happened. The emu seemed to shift, its eyes filling with actuarial tables spinning behind black pupils, and then, without moving its beak, it spoke. "Liability don't cover pecking. You think you sell protection, son, but you're just renting fear." The prophecy pierced him. He clutched his fleece tighter, desperate for its threads to hold him together. But the seams pulsed, warm, alive, breathing with him. He could no longer tell where the jacket ended and where he began. The owl's hoot from the tree line sounded more like laughter than warning. Coffee spilled across his fleece, dark stains spreading like continents on a dying map. He could not tell if it was coffee, blood, or the fabric itself bleeding out. The iPad chimed one last time. Policy canceled, risk uninsurable. He lay in the mud, staring at the sky, unsure if the fleece was protecting him or unraveling him one stitch at a time. It was only later, at a truck stop outside Baton Rouge, that the absurdity hardened into identity. Surrounded by diesel fumes and fried pies, a stranger asked him what he did. The adjuster laughed, a dry cackle that startled the pigeons off the roof, and declared, "I do radar. I do x-rays of emu testicles. That's the job. That's the calling. I'm a goddamn emu testicular radiology specialist now. .com, bitches." The stranger nodded as though it were ordinary. From then on, the title clung to him like the fleece. He began to suspect that others could see the numbers flickering across its weave, actuarial tables bleeding through nylon. The jacket was no longer just a shield, it had become a broadcast of the truth, that he had gone too far down the rabbit hole, that between owls and emus and the demands of brokers and machines, he had stopped being a man and become a specialist in the one field no one needed and everyone feared. This, then, is the frame of the Threadbare Fleece. It is not merely the story of an insurance adjuster or a machine. It is a cycle of absurd revelations stitched across gas stations, barns, and back roads. It is a study of how fabric frays, how men unravel, and how voices, avian, bureaucratic, or imagined, echo in the static of nylon seams. It's about the danger of quantifying what cannot be measured and the haunting question of whether the thing you think holds you together is actually what's dismantling you. The adjuster will return again and again, bound to the road. He will haul the TestiScan 3000 from his truck. He will listen to birds that speak in riddles, owls that laugh at the edge of fields, and brokers who see protection only in numbers. And always he'll tug his fleece tighter. The stains darken under gas station lights like continents shifting on a dying globe. This is the opening stitch of a series about absurdity and survival, about risk and unraveling, about a jacket that might be more alive than the man who wears it. This is the introduction to the Threadbare Fleece.
The Bubble and the Machine by K. Brad Barfield. The unraveling began not with a fire, a storm, or a claim gone sour, but with a single blue message bubble glowing on a screen. The adjuster, who had built his career in barns and backfields, deciphering risks with little more than a clipboard and his threadbare fleece, felt the digital chirp like a gut punch. Mandatory for all male livestock policies, portable, lightweight, user-friendly, introducing the TestiScan 3000. The words looked harmless enough, as if plucked straight from a salesman's brochure, but he knew menace when he saw it. Insurance had always been a business of numbers, but this was a trespass into the body itself. A chrome machine, portable, they said, user-friendly, shaped like something NASA misplaced in a barn, cables dangling, padded loops awaiting victims. He stared at the picture on his phone and felt his stomach turn. It was a grotesque parody of progress, a bureaucratic leap into body horror. The TestiScan 3000 was not a tool, it was a trap disguised as innovation. He imagined the brokers who dreamt it up, faces glowing in boardrooms, mouths rehearsing slogans, their eyes lit with the fever of quantification. These were men who believed every liability could be reduced to a metric, every risk captured in a neat graph. Testicle metrics are the future of liability insurance, he could hear them say, as if revelation had come down in actuarial tables. For him, it was nothing but humiliation. The fleece bristled at the thought. It had always been more than clothing, his codependent sidekick, his armor against cold mornings, his shield against indignity. It had absorbed sweat, coffee, and rainwater through years of trudging across pastures, standing at gates and scribbling notes while cows lowed in the distance. Now, as he stared at the image of the TestiScan, the seam seemed to prickle against his skin, whispering a low growl of protest. "Not us," the fleece seemed to say. "Somebody else is going to run that machine." But inevitability is the cruelest clause of all, and the adjuster knew that once the brokers had spoken, the field men would bear the burden. He imagined cornering an emu in its pen, the bird's glassy eyes fixed on him with prehistoric suspicion. He saw himself strapping the chrome device under its feathery undercarriage, listening to the hum while it measured reproductive capacities. He could almost hear the whir of numbers scrolling like slot machines, graphs blooming like cancer cells, all piped back into an iPad that would declare verdicts with the certainty of law. It was absurd. It was demeaning. It was his new reality. The adjuster sat in his truck, foam still glowing, the fleece tugged tight across his chest. He sipped stale coffee and thought about how far the profession had strayed. He had signed on to evaluate barns, to weigh the risk of wind on tin roofs, to walk fences and watch cattle for signs of disease. He had not signed on to wrangle machines that turned flesh into data points. The owl's hoot from the tree line came sharp and mocking, as if nature itself was laughing at the intrusion. Out there in the dark, the world still operated on old rules, predators and prey, feathers and fur, instinct and chance. No machine could insure against that. And yet, the brokers believed they could. He muttered under his breath, "Not me, not the fleece." His hands gripped the wheel until his knuckles blanched, the jacket's fabric pulling taut like reins in his fists. He felt a dread not unlike standing at the edge of a swollen creek, knowing you had to cross, but also knowing the current would sweep you under. The TestiScan 3000 was not just another tool. It was a coffin with straps, buzzing faintly, waiting for him in some distant barnyard. And whether he liked it or not, he knew his turn was coming. That was how the cycle began, not with a calamity, but with a message, a picture, and a promise of progress that smelled like ruin. For the adjuster, it was the first stitch pulled loose from the fleece.
The fleece objects had always leaned on the fleece more than he admitted. It was just a jacket, sure, cheap, gray, threadbare, its seams pulled tight from years of wear. But in the quiet moments, when paperwork piled higher than fence posts, or when barns leaned like tired men against the horizon, he caught himself treating it like a partner. He tugged it close when he needed courage, wrapped it around his shoulders when shame set in, and sometimes swore it pressed back against him, as if to say, "I've got you, even when the world don't." So when the TestiScan 3000 came calling, the fleece had something to say. It began as a prickling, a static whisper in the fibers. The adjuster was still in the cab of his truck, staring at the message bubble and the picture of the chrome machine when he felt it, the faint electric tug of fabric against skin. He pulled the jacket tighter, but the sensation spread, rising from his shoulders down to his ribs. For years it had been a comfort. Now it felt restless, agitated. The fleece was objecting. "Somebody else is going to run that machine," he muttered to himself, echoing the growl he thought he felt in the threads. "Not me, not the fleece." Outside, the owl hooted again. It was a sound he had heard 1,000 times before, lonely, mocking, never neutral. Tonight, it felt like laughter at his expense. The adjuster had seen plenty of absurd policies come and go. He had been asked to appraise barns that were half collapsed, hog pans that smelled like the inside of a nightmare, and goats that lived more in legend than on paper. He had carried clipboards through hailstorms, filled out loss reports with ink running down the page, and listened to farmers spin stories about tornadoes that started and ended right at the property line. He thought he could stomach anything, but the fleece knew better. The TestiScan 3000 was different. It wasn't about barns, fences, or floodplains. It was about flesh, about cornering a bird, strapping a chrome halo under its feathers, and waiting while the machine hummed its judgment. The adjuster imagined the numbers rolling like slot machines, graphs flowering on the iPad like malignant blooms. It wasn't work. It was desecration. The fleece tightened at his shoulders as if hugging him from behind. For the first time, he felt ashamed to wear it. This wasn't just another assignment. It was a violation. He remembered the brokers, those men in their glass towers speaking in tongues of liability and profit. They loved their metrics. They believed that quantification was salvation, that if they could measure it, they could master it. They never knelt in the dirt beside a restless emu. They never smelled the sour tang of feathers and dung while trying to hold a clipboard steady. To them, the TestiScan 3000 was a miracle of progress. To him, it was a coffin with straps. He sat there in the truck, thermos rattling in its holder, coffee splashed on the seat, staring out at the pen where the emu paced. Its long neck curved like a question mark, its eyes glitting with something older than math. The adjuster's hands trembled. He pulled the fleece tighter, felt the threads press into his skin like little claws. It whispered again, "Don't do it. You can't quantify everything." For a moment, he almost believed the fleece was right. He could drive away, leave the TestiScan in its box, return it to headquarters, and say the job was impossible. But he knew how that would end. Brokers didn't tolerate refusal. They would mark him non-compliant, and compliance was the only currency that mattered. Still, the fleece resisted. It grew heavier on his shoulders, hot despite the cool night air. It was as if the jacket itself had taken on his despair, thickened by it, weighed down by his dread. He looked down and saw the stains, coffee, mud, grease, shifting under the dashlight like continents on a crumbling map. For the first time, he wondered if the jacket wasn't just carrying his burdens, but was actively rewriting him stitch by stitch. The emu let out a low grumble, a sound like a drum struck underwater. It was waiting, watching, judging. The adjuster muttered to himself, "All right, boy, if it's you or me, it's gonna be me." But the words didn't stick. The fleece bristled again, and the owl hooted once more. Everything around him seemed to be speaking at once. The jacket, the owl, the emu, each voice layering over the other until he could no longer tell which one was his own.
He closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, and let out a long breath. The TestiScan 3000 waited in the bed of the truck. The fleece waited on his shoulders. The emu waited in the pen. And somewhere in the distance, the brokers waited too, their glowing screens hungry for numbers that no man, no bird, and no jacket could ever fully provide. That's when he realized the truth. This wasn't just about livestock or liability or even humiliation. This was about a war between fabric and machine, between old comforts and new demands. The fleece was his tether, yes, but it was also his conscience, and tonight it was pulling hard against the future.
Into the Pan by K. Brad Barfield. The TestiScan 3000 had a weight that belied its advertised portable convenience. The adjuster could feel it drag at his arms as he hauled it from the bed of his truck, straps clinking against chrome tubing, the whole thing buzzing faintly as if it had a heartbeat. The box it came in promised efficiency, but in his hands it felt like an unholy infant, swaddled not in blankets but in cables and belts. He wiped sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his fleece, which stuck to him as if reluctant to let him go. The emu was waiting. In the pen beyond the headlights, the bird paced with its long neck curved like a question mark. Its eyes caught the light in cold flashes, glassy and ancient, betraying nothing but suspicion. The adjuster had written 100 policies for cattle, hogs, even llamas, but nothing prepared him for this. The fleece at his shoulders grew heavier, as though whispering, "Don't do it. You can't quantify everything." But refusal wasn't in the policy. Knees in the dirt. He climbed into the pen, boots sinking into soft earth. The machine's chrome surface reflected bits of moonlight, throwing sickly green glints across the dirt. The adjuster muttered to himself, "All right, boy, just gotta slip this contraption under your situation, quick and easy." His voice sounded small, swallowed by the dark. The emu froze, then tilted its head, one eye locking on to him with unnerving intensity. He could feel its scrutiny like a physical weight pressing into his chest. He shifted, cradling the machine close, its padded loop dangling like a question mark from his hands. The fleece pressed tighter against his ribs, whispering static warnings he almost believed he could translate. His conscience and his jacket seemed to speak as one. Not this, not here, not you. The shriek. The emu didn't get the training video. When he moved closer, lowering the contraption with a fumbling tenderness, the emu exploded into motion. It shrieked, a sound like a trumpet swallowed by thunder, a primal alarm that rattled his teeth. The adjuster stumbled back, knees hitting the dirt, the machine jerking in his arms. The emu lunged, its long legs kicked, feathers raking against straps and chrome. The TestiScan lit up, its sensors sparking to life, as if thrilled by the chaos. Beams of green sliced across feathers and air, painting the pen in streaks of alien light. He wrestled with the machine, trying to shield himself as much as fitted around the bird, but the emu thrashed and screamed, wings hammering against him like fists. His fleece absorbed the blows, the fabric pulling taut as though straining to hold him together. The verdict. In the truck cab, the iPad paired to the device began its performance. Numbers jittered across the screen, climbing like gamblers' debts, graphs blooming in grotesque shapes that resembled tumors more than charts.
The display blared its definitive judgment, absurd and merciless. Testicular capacity, unstable. The adjuster froze. The words cut through the chaos with the sharpness of a verdict handed down by a judge. His knees dug into the mud, his hands trembling as the emu screamed. He couldn't tell if the machine was measuring anything real or simply laughing at him in the only language it knew. The owl hooted from the tree line, the sound mocking, triumphant. Then something shifted. The TestiScan tangled around the emu's legs like stolen jewelry, yet the bird no longer seemed merely an animal. Its eyes swelled, black marbles wet with light, and behind those pupils he thought he saw movement, spinning actuarial tables, lines of probability cascading like waterfalls. The bird's head jerked forward close enough for him to smell his breath, an incongruous mix of alfalfa and ashtrays. Without moving its beak, the emu spoke inside his skull. Liability don't cover pecking. The words clattered in his head like bolts rolling around in a coffee can. He nearly dropped the machine. You think you sell protection, son, but you're just renting fear. The adjuster gasped. His hands gripped the fleece as though it were a lifeline. The seams pulsed warm, alive, humming with a voice that joined the chorus. The jacket pressed into him, as if breathing with his lungs. He wanted to scream, to run, to tear the machine apart, but he was locked in place. The emu pressed closer, its eyes endless pools of figures and charts. It whispered in thought, 2 fleeces, 2 cells, which one you dying in? The adjuster's thermos knocked from the truck dash in the struggle spilled black roast across the cab, carving rivers through upholstery. The smell mixed with mud and feathers until he couldn't distinguish coffee from blood, fabric from skin. He looked down at his jacket and saw the stains spreading like continents on a dying map. The iPad blared one last cheerful chime. Policy canceled. Risk uninsurable. He collapsed in the dirt, machine buzzing faintly beside him, emu feathers drifting across his chest. Above, the owl laughed from the tree line, its call echoing with cruel finality. He lay still, his fleece soaked and clinging, whispering something he could no longer understand. The seams felt like they were unraveling, stitch by stitch, as if the jacket was no longer keeping him together, but pulling him apart.
The Emu's Prophecy by K. Brad Barfield. The adjuster had heard strange things in his life. Farmers swearing a tornado skipped their land out of spite, or brokers insisting a spreadsheet could capture the mysteries of mortality. But nothing prepared him for the voice inside his skull at night in the emu pen. The bird had him pinned, not with weight, but with its gaze. Its black eyes swelled like wet marbles, reflecting not moonlight but something stranger. Behind the pupils he saw motion, actuarial tables, charts spinning like carnival wheels, probability lines cascading like waterfalls. He blinked, but the vision didn't vanish. Instead, it deepened until he felt he was being pulled into those pupils as though they were tunnels. Then came the words, not spoken, not clucked or shrieked, but planted directly in his skull like nails hammered through thought. Liability don't cover pecking. The adjuster staggered backward, still gripping the machine. His fleece clung tighter, pulsing at the seams, whispering static that sounded almost like language. He tasted metal on his tongue. The bird pressed closer, its breath hot and sour, smelling of alfalfa and ashtrays. You think you sell protection, son, but you're just renting fear." The words rattled around in his head like loose bolts in a coffee can. He wanted to argue, to say, "I'm just doing my job," but his mouth wouldn't move. He could only grip the fleece tighter, the fabric alive under his fingers, threads vibrating like wires carrying current. The emu tilted its head, eyes gleaming with impossible knowledge. 2 fleeces, 2 cells. Which one you dying in? The riddle landed heavy in his chest. He didn't know what it meant. Was the bird talking about his jacket? About the life he wore like a second skin? About the parts of himself he kept zipped up against the world? The fleece pulsed again, tighter, warmer, until it seemed to breathe with him. For a terrifying moment he couldn't tell if the jacket was holding him together or pulling him apart, stitch by stitch. The emu's eyes swirled faster. Charts and graphs spun like hurricane eyes, columns of numbers marching in endless rows. He realized with horror that they weren't just actuarial tables. They were his. He saw policies he had filed, barns he'd inspected, livestock claims he'd denied. He saw every form he had ever signed, every signature trailing like a leash back to him. The numbers were alive, bleeding through the bird's eyes, through his fleece, into him. You don't insure life, you insure death. Every policy's just a bet, and every bet's already lost. The adjuster's knees gave out, and he slumped into the dirt. The TestiScan 3000 buzzed beside him like a coffin with a heartbeat. The iPad in the truck still blared numbers, grass jittering, a grotesque stock ticker of things no man should measure. Coffee stains spread across his fleece, darker now like continents shifting on a dying globe. He could smell 'em, acrid and sharp, but when he looked down he couldn't tell if it was coffee, blood, or the fabric itself bleeding out. Above him, the owl hooted again, laughter rolling down from the tree line like judgment. The emu stepped closer. Its shadow fell over him, long legs like crooked dividers splitting the earth. It pressed its head near his ear, though its beak never moved. "You're stitched wrong, son. Been stitched wrong from the start. Every seam's a lie. Every claim's a prayer you couldn't answer." The adjuster sobbed, not from fear, not entirely, but from the sudden weight of recognition. He had built a life on paperwork, on forms that promised safety, yet here he was, knees in the dirt, face pressed to feathers, a bird delivering cosmic truths he couldn't refute. For a moment, he felt the fleece not as clothing, but as a skin. It tightened around him, humming louder, alive with voices in its static threads. Some urged him to resist. Others urged him to surrender. It was a choir of unraveling nylon, a congregation of every stain, rip, and scar he had ever carried. The emu leaned closer. Its eyes burned with numbers. "You think this is about me? Son, this is about you. You're the liability. You're the unstable metric. You're the risk nobody wants to write down." The word struck him harder than any beak or claw. He realized dimly that the TestiScan had never been about livestock. It was about him. The machine had been measuring all along, not feathers or flesh, but the unraveling of a man bound to his fleece. The iPad chimed one last time. Policy canceled. Risk uninsurable. The owl's laughter crescendoed. The emu's eyes dimmed, their actuarial storms retreating into blackness. And then, as suddenly as it began, the prophecy ended. The bird stepped back, feathers shaking, returning to its pen as if nothing had happened. The adjuster collapsed flat into the mud, his fleece soaked,
whispering faintly with every breath he took, "Aftermath." When he finally staggered to his feet, dawn was breaking. The sky bled cranberry red along the horizon, fading into cobalt blue. The pen was quiet. The emu stared at him with glassy indifference. No longer prophet, but simply bird. He lifted the TestiScan 3000, its chrome surface smeared with mud, feathers, and his own blood. It buzzed weakly, like a machine that had lost its purpose. He shoved it back into the truck bed, slammed the tailgate, and climbed into the cab. The fleece clung to him, tighter than ever, whispering still. He couldn't make out words anymore, just static, the faint hum of unraveling. He pulled it close anyway, shivering in the morning light. He knew now that the emu hadn't cursed him. It had revealed him. He wasn't selling protection. He wasn't even selling fear. He was selling himself, one stitch at a time, until nothing remained but the jacket and the road, and the owl always laughing.
Collapse and Cancellation by K. Brad Barfield. The prophecy left him hollow, not empty, but scraped out, as if the emu's words had dug trenches through his chest and filled them with actuarial debris. He knelt in the dirt, jacket clinging like wet skin, the TestiScan 3000 buzzing faintly beside him, its chrome scarred with mud and feathers. The air smelled of coffee, manure, and ozone, a cocktail of defeat. The iPad in the cab blared again, the glow harsh against the windshield. The graphs jittered, numbers leapt, a grotesque carnival of metrics spinning toward collapse. Then, with a cheerful chime that cut sharper than an insult, the verdict flashed across the screen. Policy canceled. Risk uninsurable. The adjuster laughed once, a dry bark that cracked his throat. It was the kind of laugh that wasn't laughter at all, but the release of pressure before a man split apart. His thermos knocked over in the chaos. It spilled down the seat and into the floorboard, black roast carving rivers through upholstery. The smell of it mingled with his fleece, sharp and acidic, as if the fabric itself were bleeding caffeine and shame. The stain. He looked down at the spreading blotch across his chest. In the dim light, it pulsed like a continent drifting on some doomed map. For a moment, he couldn't tell what it was. Coffee, blood, sweat, or the fabric finally bleeding itself dry. The fleece clung tight, seams unraveling in places, glowing faintly in others. Each tug of a seam felt like a stitch popping in his own skin. The emu had retreated to its corner, glassy-eyed and silent, as if nothing had happened. But the echo of its prophecy, "You're the liability, you're the risk nobody wants to write down," clanged in his skull like a church bell rung by lightning. He pressed his hands to his fleece, clutching it like a man praying through cloth. The seams pulsed with warmth, almost alive, whispering faint static words he couldn't decipher. The adjuster's chest heaved. He wondered if the fleece was holding him together or unraveling him one stitch at a time. Mud baptism. Then the weight became too much. He pitched forward into the dirt. Mud soaked through his knees and chest. His face pressed into the earth, grit mixing with the coffee already drying on his skin. For a moment he lay there, motionless, the buzzing of the TestiScan 3000 rising and falling like a dying breath beside him.
The owl hooted from the tree line, mocking, triumphant. Its call rolled across the pasture like laughter echoing in a courthouse hallway. He tried to curse at it, but mud filled his mouth. He spat, the taste sharp and metallic. The fleece pulsed harder now, its weight unbearable. He could hear voices in its threads, a choir of stains and seams, farmers, brokers, birds, owls, all murmuring through the static. Some laughed, some warned, some wept. He pressed his fists into the fabric, begging it to silence. But the fleece would not be quiet. The coffin with straps. The TestiScan 3000 let out a long electronic sigh, its green beams flickering across the dirt. The padded loop swung like a noose from its chrome frame. He saw it not as a tool anymore, but as a coffin with straps, buzzing faintly like it had a heartbeat. In that moment, he knew. It hadn't failed. It had succeeded too well. The machine hadn't measured livestock. It had measured him. It had weighed his fear, his unraveling, his threadbare dependence on fabric and ritual. And the iPad's cheerful verdict, risk uninsurable, wasn't about the emu at all. It was about him. The adjuster collapsed deeper into the mud, baptized in dirt, coffee, and sweat. He felt like he had crossed a threshold, though into what he didn't know. His fleece clung tighter, whispering its static gospel, and he let himself sink. Silence and sunrise. When he finally stirred, the night was thinning. A pale smear of light stretched along the horizon, cranberry red bleeding into cobalt blue. The emu had stilled, feathers ruffled, eyes glassy and dumb. The owl was silent now, though he could feel its absence like a smirk. He tried to drag himself upright, every joint heavy with mud. His fleece weighed him down like a sodden shroud. He staggered to the truck, yanked open the door, and collapsed into the driver's seat. The iPad had gone dark. The thermos rolled under the seat, dripping the last of its black contents. The fleece whispered faintly still, words just out of reach. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel and let the static hum through him. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself what he'd always feared. He was the unstable metric, the risk no policy could cover. And yet, he was still insured by something. Not the brokers, not the machine, not even himself. Only the fleece, threadbare and whispering, keeping him tethered in ways he couldn't understand. The long drive. He turned the key. The truck coughed, roared, and settled into a growl. He pulled out of the pen, headlights cutting across the pasture, catching the emu in one last beam. The bird stared back, silent, inscrutable, as if the prophecy had been spent and it was only bird again. The adjuster drove toward the horizon, toward the faint light. His fleece clung to him, heavy with stains, whispering still. He didn't know where the road would take him, only that it would not let him rest. Somewhere between the owl's laughter and the emu's silence, he had been marked. And the TestiScan 3000, buzzing faintly in the truck bed, would ride with him.
The Truck Stop Revelation by K. Brad Barfield. The road carried him south through hours of silence, broken only by the rattle of tools in the truck bed and the faint dying buzz of the TestiScan 3000. The fleece clung to him like a wet second skin, whispering now and then in static murmurs he could not quite translate. He drove past fields still heavy with dew, past gas stations not yet open, past roadside churches with plastic letters rearranged by the wind. He could feel the owl's laughter chasing him, even with the windows rolled up tight. By the time he rolled into Baton Rouge, the sun had burned away the last traces of dawn. Diesel fumes hung thick over the truck stop. Pigeons strutted across the roof of the convenience store. Somewhere at Friar popped, filling the air with the grease-sweet smell of pies gone stale. He pulled in slow, engine growling, and killed the ignition. The adjuster sat for a moment, gripping the wheel, his fleece damp against his chest. His thermos rattled on the floorboard, still dripping its bitter river into the mats. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket and left a streak of mud, sweat, and something darker. The seams pulsed once under his fingertips, faint but steady, like a heartbeat not his own. He stepped out of the truck. The ground felt unsteady beneath him, as if the emu's prophecy still echoed in the dirt. He tugged the fleece tighter, though the Louisiana air was already hot, sticky enough to glue fabric to his back. He walked toward the store, boots dragging, the words still circling in his skull. Policy canceled. Risk uninsurable. The question. Inside the truck stop, the air was heavy with the smell of coffee burnt to tar. Truckers in faded caps sat in booths, their shoulders hunched, their voices low. The fan turned lazily overhead, stirring more dust and breeze. The adjuster ordered nothing. He just sat at the counter, fleece pulled tight, elbows on the formica. The woman behind the register gave him a look but said nothing. He knew how he must have looked. Mud-stained, coffee-soaked, jacket unraveling. It was a stranger who broke the silence. A man 2 stools down, his plate stacked with biscuits, leaned over and asked the simplest of questions. "So, what do you do?" The adjuster laughed. Not a real laugh, but a dry, rattling cackle that startled the pigeons off the roof outside. Heads turned, the woman at the register flinched. He couldn't help it. The laugh rose unbidden, sharp as a cough, rough as gravel. He wiped his mouth with the frayed cuff of his fleece and answered, "Well, sir, apparently I do radar. I do X-rays of emu testicles. That's the job. That's the calling. I guess I'm a goddamn emu testicular radiology specialist now. .com, bitches." The words fell out of him like a confession, a statement of fact, not boast, but surrender. The stranger blinked, nodded slowly, and went back to his biscuits, as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The badge of absurdity. The adjuster sat in silence after that, the weight of his declaration pressing down on him. He realized that in speaking it aloud, he had claimed the title. No broker had assigned it, no policy had mandated it. He had chosen it himself, or maybe the fleece had whispered it into his mouth. He tugged the jacket tighter. The stains on it darkened under the gas station lights, shape-shifting like continents on an ancient map. He closed his eyes, but the numbers followed, branded on the inside of his lids. The fleece had become more than armor. It was broadcasting now, louder than his voice ever could. The truth wasn't in the iPad or the machine. The truth was stitched into the seams of the jacket, unraveling for all the world to see. He realized then that his fate had already been sealed in the mud of that pen. The TestiScan had measured him, found him wanting, and canceled the policy. He wasn't a man anymore, not in the way brokers or farmers understood. He was something stranger, stitched together by threads of absurdity and prophecy. And in that truck stop, surrounded by diesel fumes, fried pies, and strangers who nodded at madness as if it were common, he accepted it. He was the emu testicular radiology specialist. Not just a punchline, not just a curse, but a title, a badge of absurdity pinned on him by bird and machine alike. He paid for nothing, left nothing, and walked back out into the heat. His truck waited, humming faintly, the TestiScan buzzing in the bed like a trapped insect. He climbed inside, pulled the fleece tighter, and started the engine. The owl's laughter was still out there somewhere, beyond the tree line. The emu's prophecy still clattered in his skull. But now he had a name. A grotesque, ridiculous name, but a name all the same. He smiled bitterly. .com, bitches.
The Endless Road by K. Brad Barfield. The road stretched ahead, unspooling like a frayed seam, vanishing into heat shimmer and diesel haze. The adjuster drove it without destination, the TestiScan 3000 rattling faintly in the bed of the truck, the fleece whispering against his skin with every mile. He no longer thought of it as a jacket. It was a partner, a parasite, a radio tower broadcasting truths he didn't want to hear but couldn't shut out. The declaration he had made at the Baton Rouge truck stop still hung in the air. I'm a goddamn emu testicular radiology specialist now. .com, bitches. He had spoken it in bitterness, but the title stuck, woven into him as tightly as the fleece itself. Each mile only confirmed it. The brokers could strip him of policies. Machines could cancel his clients. Owls could laugh from the trees. But the road had given him a name, and the fleece insisted he carry it. The weight of the fleece. He pulled it tighter around him, though the day was hot, humidity thick enough to drown. The jacket stank of coffee, mud, sweat, and something else, something metallic, like old coins rubbed smooth. The stains had spread into dark continents, borders shifting with each bend of his arms. Sometimes he thought he saw numbers flickering across them, actuarial tables bleeding through the fabric like spectral tattoos. The seams pulsed faintly, warm, alive. At night, he swore they whispered in static voices, the owl, the emu, the brokers, the farmers, all speaking at once. It was a choir of liability, a gospel of risk. Some voices laughed, some cried, some just repeated the verdict, risk uninsurable. And yet the fleece kept him tethered. Without it, he was sure he'd dissolve into the road like an oil slick. Bills and burdens. Practical life refused to release him. Every stop brought news of bills stacking higher. Plumbers, electricians, roofers, all circling like vultures with clipboards, demanding thousands of dollars for repairs to the family home he had promised to reclaim. He couldn't escape the numbers even off the clock. Every conversation was a ledger. Every handshake was a claim. Then came the call about his daughter, pregnant, a new life on the way. The word shook him more than any emu prophecy. He pressed the phone to his ear, listening, nodding, whispering congratulations, but inside his chest, panic clattered like loose boats in a coffee can. How could he help her when he could barely hold himself together? How could he provide when his only specialty was absurd? The fleece prickled against him, seams buzzing louder. Do more testicular radiology, it seemed to say. Do more. That's all you've got left. The fool's profession. He laughed bitterly, startling himself. Somewhere along the road between Baton Rouge and nowhere, he had stopped being a man and become a cosmic jester. A clown in a fleece soaked with stains, carting around a chrome machine that hissed and buzzed like a coffin with straps. His profession wasn't real, and yet it consumed him. He thought of himself as the last fool on the payroll, insuring gonads while the world cracked open at the seams. He could almost hear the brokers clapping from their towers, chanting their gospel, Metrics are the future. Metrics are salvation. And yet, they had abandoned him too. The TestiScan 3000 canceled him as efficiently as it had canceled the emu. But the fleece refused to let him quit. It clung tighter with each mile, humming with static truths. You can't measure everything, but you'll try anyway. You can't save anyone, but you'll sell the promise anyway. That's the job. That's the road. The road eternal. Night came again, cobalt blue sinking into cranberry red twilight. Fireflies rose from the roadside ditches, tiny sparks of light mocking his headlights. The owl hooted somewhere far off, laughter echoing through the trees. He pulled into another truck stop, another gas station, another nowhere. The faces inside all blurred together, men in caps, women with weary eyes, strangers nodding at him like they already knew his story. And when one asked what he didn't hesitate this time. I measured testicular abundance. That's my trade. No one laughed. They just nodded. And that was worse than mockery. Back in his truck, Fleece pulled tight, he finally admitted the truth. The TestiScan 3000 wasn't an assignment. It was a mirror. It had shown him not livestock metrics, but his own unraveling, his own uninsurable soul. The emu had been right. He wasn't selling protection. He wasn't even renting fear. He was selling himself, 1 mile, 1 stitch at a time. The fleece pulsed with warmth, whispering louder now. He closed his eyes, let the static wash over him, and smiled bitterly. Maybe it wasn't keeping him together. Maybe it was unraveling him. But it was all he had. He turned the key, the truck roared, and the road stretched on. The owl laughed. The emu's prophecy echoed. The broker's gospel hummed, and the fleece whispered, always the fleece, whispering him forward. The adjuster drove on, forever bound to the absurdity, forever measuring what should never be measured, forever stitched into a profession no one wanted and everyone feared. He was, and always would be, the emu testicular radiology specialist. .com, bitches. Sources. This essay is part of the Threadbare Fleece cycle, an original work of fiction by K. Brad Barfield. Hashtag Threadbare Fleece. Hashtag satire. Hashtag insurance. Hashtag emu.
The Unraveling Stitch by K. Brad Barfield. Every story leaves a seam behind, a loose thread that won't stop dangling. For the adjuster, the fleece was that thread. It clung to him through barns, truck stops, emu pens, and long nights of static whispers, always fraying, always holding, always on the edge of coming apart. When the TestiScan 3000 arrived, sleek, chrome, and humming with bureaucratic cheer, it was never just a machine. It was the sharp tug that began the unraveling. We followed him through the absurd, the blue message bubble announcing metrics for male livestock policies, the dreaded moment of strapping chrome to feathers, the emu's shriek that lit up beams of green across the night, the prophecy whispered into his skull about liability and fear. We saw him collapse into mud and coffee, baptized in stains that became continents on his chest. We watched him stumble into a Baton Rouge truck stop where laughter cracked out of him like a gunshot, and he named himself with bitter pride,
the Emu Testicular Radiology Specialist.com, bitches. And we rode him down the endless road, the fleece whispering, the machine buzzing in the truck bed, the owl laughing from the trees. The fleece was never just fabric. It was the conscience he couldn't silence, the tether he couldn't cut. It held the smell of barns, diesel, and black roast. It held the stains of defeat. It pulsed with static, breathing with him, whispering truths he didn't want to face. Was it keeping him together, or was it unraveling him one stitch at a time? By the end, the answer no longer mattered. The fleece had become inseparable from the man. He wore it as he wore his absurd new title, both shield and curse. The brokers spoke in numbers, prophets of quantification who believed every risk could be turned into a metric. The TestiScan 3000 was their gospel in chrome, their dream of reducing the chaos of livestock and life to graphs on an iPad. But the Emu shredded that illusion with its prophecy. You don't insure life, you insure death. Every policy's just a bet, and every bet's already lost. The adjuster learned the truth the brokers never would. He wasn't selling protection. He wasn't even renting fear. He was selling himself, one claim, one drive, one stitch at a time. The TestiScan had never been measuring birds. It had been measuring him. The cosmic fool. By the last mile, the adjuster had embraced his role as a cosmic jester, a fool in a stained fleece, carrying a buzzing coffin with straps, speaking truths nobody asked for and everybody feared. He became the punchline no one laughed at, the grotesque specialist in a field that shouldn't exist. And yet, there was a dignity in his absurdity. He carried the title like a badge, wore the fleece like armor, and drove on through the laughter of owls and the silence of birds. He didn't belong to the brokers anymore. He belonged to the road, to the jacket, to the endless absurdity of being stitched wrong from the start. The final stitch. The story of the adjuster is not about livestock or even about machines. It is about the threadbare fabric that binds us, the jackets we cling to, the absurd identities we carry, the ways we measure ourselves against impossible scales. It is about the unraveling stitch that reminds us we're more fragile than we pretend. For him, that stitch was a fleece. For us, it might be something else, but the lesson is the same. You cannot insure everything. You cannot measure every risk. And the moment you try, you find yourself face to face with the owl's laughter and the emu's prophecy, realizing that some parts of life are not meant for policies. He drives still, somewhere out there, headlights cutting through the dark, the fleece whispering, the seams glowing faintly. The TestiScan 3000 hums in the truck bed, the owl hoots from the tree line, and the road stretches on without end. The adjuster is gone, but the fleece remains, and the stitch, once pulled, will never be put back.